being fair to say.
Yeah, I mean that's one of the things that's one of the points that I bring up to actually dispel the idea of any human nature. People say, oh no, we're greedy by nature, we're hostile by nature, we're selfish by nature, all this sort of stuff. And I'm like, well, think about it this way: if you study different cultures across the planet that live in different social strata, where they have different societal values, sometimes even different economic values, economic systems, do you see an identical pattern of human behaviour being displayed in every single one? Do you have serial killers on the kibbutzim? No, you don't.
Yeah.
Do you have like Wall Street banker type mentality people on the kibbutzim? No, you don't.
Yeah, exactly. It's absolutely true, isn't it? And that's the real thing. Violence is not equally distributed. It's not equal in level of violence. Just look at the numbers that Bill Hicks used to always talk about. But this was back in 1994, I think it was, when he said, last year in America, where they love handguns, 23,000 deaths from handguns. Britain, where handguns just aren't a part of culture,
14.
It was 14. That's right. And he always jokes that it was probably American tourists. Okay. But it's such a huge difference, and how can you not understand that it's obviously a cultural element? And so when you fan out and look at the broader view of international war and international globalization efforts and international banks, you realize that really the dominant structure you're seeing that keeps coming up over and over again has actually come from a very small set of values that have been amplified out through propaganda and through piggybacking off necessity to enforce monetary systems. Greece is learning this one all too late now. These are magnified versions of elements of the social system. It's not natural for human beings to be predatory upon each other.
Mm. How much would you say that the issue of language holds us back as a spirit?
Well,
how much of a barrier would you say that poses?
Language is a really tricky one, man. I studied semiology back in university, and it woke me up to the fact that I'd never considered how language actually works. Semiology or semiotics is the study of language and how it literally works. So you have an identifier and you have an identified. The identifier is the word itself, and the identified is the thing itself.
Yeah. And
we don't really distinguish these anymore in the way that we use them. So we forget, for example, that broadly speaking, communism doesn't actually have an identified. We can argue all we like all day about communism. We're arguing about an abstract term with no definite reference to it that it's not defined, you see. It's all very well when you do it about tables, because you and I have a pretty good idea about what a table is, and even though they may not have four legs, we can actually agree on what a table is and isn't, based on its function, based on its real-world use, right? But then you get to sort of second-order levels of abstraction, and if you want to read a fascinating book about this, and you might have done already, there's a book out there, there's two actually, there's one I haven't read and one I have, and the one I have I'll talk about. There's obviously the really, really heavy work by Korzybski. I think it's Anton Korzybski, I'm not sure now. Called Science and Sanity, which actually gave birth to the whole idea of general semantics. General semantics comes from that book. And general semantics is the understanding of understandings, if you like. It's the analysis of meanings and how the mechanisms of language work. And based on that book in part, although it actually overlaps on a lot of other things, is a work by, I've actually forget his name. No, Stuart Chase. Stuart Chase, S-T-U-A-R-T, Chase, called the
Tyranny of Words?
Tyranny of Words, exactly.
Yeah.
Which mentions Korzybski, also mentions quite a lot of other things. Stuart Chase is very famous for one thing, and that is that he probably coined the phrase New Deal for Roosevelt's administration. He actually came up with that first. In fact, he has got a book, New Deal. Yeah. And he writes about that as well. He says, there are first order levels of abstraction, which is basic things in real life that we've assigned a noise to, right? As Terence McKenna puts it, my small mouth noises will be recognized by your brain, and you'll learn that when I make that small mouth noise, you know to go and get it for me. Right. So it's that kind of that level. But then there's a second order level of abstraction, which is feelings and, general ideas, the internal, if you like, ideas that we have. And then there are third order abstractions that are actually abstractions about the second order abstractions. And Chase actually maps these really, really well and delivers them in a way that are really clear. So, for example, he starts off the book by saying, man, I just don't understand philosophy. And I never have. I'm bad at it. And then one day I realized that it might not be my fault, but by the fact that philosophy is operating out of a language that can't accurately describe things, and that you're trying to describe abstractions with other abstractions. And unless we actually sit down and say, right, what is it that you're talking about? That we'll just never get anywhere and we'll go in circles. And this bleeds through to how we present this movement very clearly. People are not very good at language yet, including myself. I stumble, I use the wrong words, I can probably be taken out of context, which proves that the language doesn't work. You can't take maths out of context, really. You can take an individual item in a mathematical equation. The equation is a whole piece. You can't put it amongst a bunch of other equations and it suddenly means something else. No, its function's still the same, right? And we have the same issue. People misunderstand what we're saying. People project into what we're saying with other words that they've heard because they haven't been given the chance to decode what we're saying, or we're maybe not decoding it correctly either. And so we do actually always have to go back to first principles. And this is where, for example, if you listen to Jacques Fresco talk, right, from the Venus Project, he'll repeat himself a lot. Or if you ask him something, he'll start off by saying 5 different things and then come to your question. And as Neil from VTV Radio, V-Radio always puts it, he says, it's when he's answered that last bit that you suddenly realize it was the 5 other seemingly unrelated things that you were about to ask next.
Yeah, so it's... So I think he's also referred to it as the boomerang answer that preempts other questions that you might ask afterwards.
Yeah, and of course the reason you're asking those is because you're busy trying to decode his final answer. But what he's done is to sit down, and what any good person will do, is to sit down and say, listen, here are my reference. And I'm not going to label them as reference yet. I just want you to follow the train of thought, the logic here. This is this, this is that. Some people think this about this, but actually what we're thinking about is this. And here's what bias means, and blah, 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 and now, bam. And you go, oh, wow, I can decode my own biases for myself now.
Yeah.
That's pretty good. Language should be to empower people to think correctly. And at the moment, with the way that the media is used, especially how the media is used, actually, we are deliberately not being given the chance to decode correctly because they want you to think something. They want you to scream, yeah, I agree, without actually having analysed what's going on and without looking at the root causes. And so we're emerging out of this very uncommunicative language. It's a very noisy and very verbose language, but it's uncommunicative in the real sense of getting one idea intact from one head to another, from one community to another, from one audience member to another, from one presenter to an audience. And that is a very big job, and language will have to be recoded eventually. In fact, we're sort of already doing it. Computer code is helping us, and at least the internet is helping us to, at least in some sense, reorder language and reorder items in their relational form without us having to say, I think this is connected to this. It's sort of doing it for us. But only to some extent. Really, ultimately, we're going to have to become better communicators as human beings, especially as we start looking at hyper-emotionally connected items like, for example, our way of life. That's exactly when the emotional stuff kicks in and when language starts to fail. And that's a big job, man. It's a big job. And I don't have all the answers on that. All I can say is that people should read Chase's book for laymen. If you really want to get into it, there are members of the movement who on TalkShoe actually have devoted hours and hours and hours to reading through Korzybski's work and explaining it and having it explained back to them by other members and just sitting. And there's one guy who's been through the book 4 times, which
really?
Is so helpful. It's all there already, man. And of course, again, it's just it's just their reading of the book. But the goal of that book is to not just have one reading of the book, but to actually come across with a viable sort of string of assertions based on how language works, what we want it to work like, and what the mechanism of thought actually is. It's very, very interesting. I've got the book at home, and I am going to try and go through it this year. But be warned, it's about 900 pages.
Wow.
It's a big one. But language is a huge topic, and that's really just a broad entry point from me, at least.
Yeah. Okay, I can move on to the next point. How would you say? Well, I'd say the answer to this one is self-evident, but how would you say the issue of violence holds us back?
Well, we've already touched on human nature, so I won't reiterate that bit. But I mean, at the moment, let's talk about how it holds us back as a movement, actually. The growing fear that we're going to have as a movement, as we get traction, as our ideas start to go into the mainstream, whether they're recognized as ours or not, because they're, of course, not our ideas. As these ideas come about and as people become advocates of a system that is other, in the sense that it is simply the not-self of the system that we have now, is we are going to be met with violence eventually. They'll ignore us first, then there'll be an extreme amount of violence. I mean, first off, there'll be a declaration that these are terrorist ideals. Ideals it'll be, it'll be ideals. Because that's something that, of course, can never exist, right? And then, of course, after that, there'll be general imprisonment. For this, you can, I mean, and this is not just the movement, this is anybody who goes against the state. I'll tell you what, I'll pick someone else. Julian Assange, right? There's a man who has leaked more into the public record than has been published on Wikipedia, right? And it's all stuff that he was not meant to know and that none of us are meant to know. But he's, by the mechanism of the internet, he's managed to maintain it out there. Where is he right now? I believe at the moment, today, he's fighting extradition to Sweden on bogus charges that will ultimately land him in the United States. The reason being, you have done something that's against the status quo, and therefore you will be imprisoned. That is a form of violence, by the way. It doesn't have to be people kicking down the door and arresting you violently. The violence is in the control of your actions and body, and that's why I said before that things like prison is the ownership of a human being. There's a particularly good chapter in the book Value Wars by John McMurtry that explicitly emphasizes this, that prison isn't corrective. That mechanism of society is a sort of structural violence mechanism to own your body should you, A, step out of line, B, break legitimate laws against other human beings, which does exist. I mean, there are people who hurt people, and people need to be protected, of course. But, of course, at the same time, if you want to protect people, the last thing you would ever want to do is have a vast prison system, because it produces very dangerous people out of sometimes non-violent people. So if that's your goal, you've got to rethink the prison system. And so, also if you are a danger to that society in that you are proponent of ideas that threaten the status quo, lock him up, because lock him up is equal to shut him up, right? So that kind of violence I see as a problem to anybody. Look at Aung San Suu Kyi in Burma. She was under house arrest for almost 30 years. That's the violence at its most extreme. It's You leave, we'll kill you. Right? And she was a democratically elected leader of Burma, but the military junta didn't like it, and so what do? You imprison them in their own home. That's violence too. So when
you just completely, just take them out altogether.
Right, and so we've now been divorced from this idea of the value of human life or what it means to have some kind of conflict ended. There's just we won. It's a little bit like American football. It seems to just go on forever. Yeah. But there are these little pockets of celebration about meaningless things. And it's like that with baseball too, I think. And in fact, golf. And in fact, a lot of sports. I'm not a huge watcher of sports. But so I see that's a very, very negative development in the way that we have attitudes towards war, really. And Osama bin Laden is just one example. There are many others, So I mean, that's enough for me about that one, I think.
I guess in another way, going back to what you were saying earlier about when people challenge the status quo, and another way apart from imprisoning them is just to take them out completely. Yeah. I mean, assassinations, they're one of the things that sort of get painted over with some sort of weird gloss where...
Oh, I'm sorry, Adam. If you want to talk about that, then you're just a crazy conspiracy theorist. Sorry, case. Yeah. Well, who can we think of, then? Who are some of the most obvious examples?
Well, the most obvious, like Gandhi, for example. I mean, between 1934 and 1948, there were 5 attempted assassinations on him. But, on the 30th of January 1948, I think it was, he was shot and killed. John Fitzgerald Kennedy, otherwise known as JFK, he was shot November 22nd, 1963. Well, we're not even going to go into the JFK because
of course his brother Robert F. Kennedy as well, another social reformer who was really going to stick it to the status quo. You know, that whole family, man. You know, Ted Kennedy, a man who's battled for healthcare reform, of course, died of brain cancer, which is a form of assassination if you think about it. You know, you don't formulate